just about 3 months into the role, it's really interesting to hear from. It would be really interesting to hear. Well, starting with what drew you to the role.
Mm,
I'd love to hear more because, interestingly enough, in the process, you and I we didn't interact in the process except for one time,
yeah.
just as part of the formal process. So it'll be interesting to hear a little bit more for folks to hear what drew you into the role.
Well, I see that Julie Edsforth is part of the audience today, and Julie gave me a call. Julie runs a executive search firm, and she gave me a call, and she said that this position had come up, and that the incumbent had mentioned the fact that if I was interested, that I might be someone that was appropriate for the role. And I got really excited about the potential of it, but a little bit humbled by the idea of succeeding someone that's been such a strong leader on racial equity. As I went through the process every day that I was part of the process, and I did a lot of research trying to understand what the role is, what success has been, where the challenges are going forward. I got more and more excited about it, and did a little bit of digging below the surface to try to find out what I would be inheriting if I were successful in that
Mhm.
role. I tell people all the time that when I was going through the interview and one of the staff members asked me about my feelings on anti-racism and on anti-Blackness in particular, and I found myself saying, this is the organization that I want to be a part of. If they're willing to even ask that question
Mm.
and to expect that the candidates would have a response to it, that's an organization that I want to be a part of, because that's something that I've dedicated my life to trying to advance. And
Mhm.
so when I got the phone call from Gabriella, thinking actually that she was going to call me and tell me that I hadn't gotten the job, and when she told me that I did get it, it took me a while to kind of let that sink in, and have been excited every day since, by being able to bring whatever I have to bear to working with the staff and pushing on racial equity and just good nonprofit leadership.
Mhm. That's fantastic, and I think that's true of your experience around that question, right? Around what do you think of anti-racism? Why is equity important? Why is anti-blackness important to understand? I think that that's been true of, we asked that question. I still do that months later. The Children's Alliance, and because I am a member and a donor and a happy member. Um, uh, the Always ask that question, not because I think we are looking for the right answer, but we want people to lean in. And that's
That's
what's so
right.
extraordinary about the people who are gathered on this call and about you, is that desire to lean in on that question, even when it is uncomfortable, even when we are scrambling for answers, to always lean in. So I did a little happy jig when I got a text that you had accepted the position. Did a little happy jig in my house. So now that you're about 3 months in, um, is there anything, what surprises you? What are you struck by now that you've had a little bit of a chance to breathe? What strikes you?
Well, we are in a particular moment in American history. As someone who has spent a fair amount of time reading American history and trying to understand American history, I feel like we are in a very unique moment. And I think an organization like the Children's Alliance has a great opportunity to advance, um, you know, care and concern about kids, and
Mhm.
particularly anti-racist practices and racial equity practices. So an intention and a focus on those kids that are furthest away from and have been most um, impacted by the inaction and inattention that society has shown them and systems have shown them. We're in a very unique moment where, as a result of the racial unrest that we saw as a result of the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor murders, that there's an opportunity for, uh, in particular, for Black leadership that
Mhm.
has not been in existence before.
Mhm.
I've been struck by the number of people who've reached out to me and asked me to be on different panels, have asked me to inform their decision-making processes. And, you know, I'm just 3 months into this role, so I have a whole lot to learn, but I see it as an opportunity that I don't want to let pass,
Mhm.
because the door is open now for some new voices to come in and have impact. And so
Mhm.
our organization as a whole, I think, needs to be well positioned and well equipped to respond to the moment. And I think that's what all the staff and I are working really hard to try to seize on this unique moment that we have. Because
Mhm.
as we well know, it will not last forever, right? And so during the time that we have it, we need to do all that we can to capitalize on it.
Yeah, and it's interesting to try to think about what is the role of a child advocacy organization, as you've been describing, to turn the moment into a movement
Right.
and a continuing movement. And I think for a percentage of the folks in the country, it's a moment. And as you've expressed, for um, folks who are directly impacted or most impacted by racism, this moment is a long moment.
Right.
Um, this is always the focus of the community. And so I think there's such a special and particular responsibility, I think, for organizations like Children's Alliance that aren't necessarily out of communities of color, but are seeking to work alongside
Right.
and learn from and advocate with communities of color and other communities most directly impacted by racism, um, to make sure that it's a movement and not a moment. And I think that that's reflective of the membership of the Children's Alliance as well. Annually, the organization does a member survey, and the organization used the member survey to help build the most recent strategic plan.
Right.
The question that we asked at the time was, what do you want the organization to be doing about racial equity and anti-racism in the next couple of years, given what's going on? And this was in 2019 or late 2018. What do you want to see the organization do? And we had so many responses that said, help me. I want to be a better advocate around racial equity. I want to be more powerful around racial equity, but I need help.
Right.
And I count on the support of the Children's Alliance for education, for opportunity, come do a training, please send more information. But people clearly in their communities want to make this a movement and not a moment. And so I think the fact um, that Children's Alliance members are already so um, powerfully focused on racial equity, is really a tribute to, well, it's a good, it's advantageous.
Yeah.
It's deeply advantageous, I think, to the moment,
Yeah.
and the effort to make it a movement.
Yeah. When you say going from a moment to a movement, I think about my tenure in this role, and I think about what was going on when I accepted the position. You know, there
Mm-hmm.
were marches in the streets that were going
Mm-hmm.
on when I said yes to this position.
Mm-hmm.
There was a rich conversation about the Confederate flag and Confederate monuments that was going
Mm-hmm.
on. And all of those things are nice, but those are symbols. Someone
Mm-hmm.
putting a Black Lives Matter sign in their front yard is a symbol.
Yeah.
But the things that I saw in that same strategic planning exercise, the responses that came back were things about changing systems as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to changing symbols. And
Mm-hmm.
I think in my mind, that is what going from a moment to a movement is all about. And I
Mm-hmm.
think Children's Alliance is uniquely positioned to do the
Mm-hmm.
movement type work that needs to be done so that our passion and our energy during that moment is sustained and becomes something
Yeah.
real and changes people's lives over time.
Yeah. I think the organization has a really interesting role to play, um, in the conversation about, and both in learning and sharing and lifting up sort of the depth of systemic racism and specifically anti-Blackness in not only in public policies, but frankly also in public policy change work
Right.
and in and then in the nonprofit and funding structure.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of opportunities there. Oh, I'm going to say something jargony that I'm excited about. There are a lot of levers to push. No, you don't push a lever. Dang it. Anyway, there's a lot of levers that could be used to change the environment in which we are all trying to make things better for kids and families. But that, you know, and I think this is particularly important for a Black leader to think about how anti-Blackness shows up, and to be able, you know, both in the external work and as well as in our internal practices.
I agree. I agree. It, you know, the responses I've gotten so far have been uniformly positive. But I know that anti-Blackness is a concept and a practice that is deeply embedded and frequently invisible, but very real. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And, you know, we have to fight against it. And I think we're in a unique moment to try to push against that practice.
Yeah. And I'm, you know, I'm so grateful that a leader like you stepped up in this alignment of stars moment that we're in, right? In addition to the long, the deep roots and long arms of systemic racism, in light of this increased interest on the part of some, you know, increased a sort of like public societal interest in the worth of Black lives, a pandemic, the pandemic's input, you know, impact on state and federal budgets, and then whatever happened last night, whatever that thing was that happened last night.
We're not talking about that.
Yeah, we're not talking about that. But this is such an incredible moment for you to step into this work. And I think in a lot of that, we all have to kind of take care of ourselves. And I'm curious, as a Black leader, and I think about this too, how do you manage the ongoing heartbreak of white supremacy? How do you fight cynicism? How do you hold on to hope? Because I know you to be this incredible combination of pragmatic and aspirational. And somebody who holds hope at the center. So not to put you on the spot, but how do you fight cynicism and hold on to hope as a Black leader?
That's a great question, and it does put me on the spot in a way, but I'm more than happy to field the question. I go back to my my school board experience. So I got elected into the school board in 2013 and served through 2017. And I see in the audience the superintendent that I served with, that I hired, that I helped to hire and served with, Larry Nyland. And in some ways, it was the most difficult role that I've ever had, to be an elected school board leader who ran on a very explicit commitment to address our opportunity gaps, the difference in achievement between racial subgroups of students. And, you know, we fought tremendous battles. There were times where I felt like I was toe to toe with people who were strongly opposed to that idea. I'm also noting one of my colleagues that was on the board at the time, Marty McLaren, is in the audience today. So I appreciate the fact that Seattle Public Schools is in the house too. But during that time, I recognized how fortunate I was to be in a position, you know, as a person who knows enough about my family's history to know that I am very fortunate to be able to represent my family and to represent families like mine that didn't have access to political power, that didn't have the opportunity to have a say in any aspect of their lives, right? That I get to be the person that does get to have that type of impact. And so I wanted to honor my relatives who, you know, were slaves and then sharecroppers and then did not get an opportunity to live up to their God-given potential because of the systemic racism that we're talking about. And so that kept me motivated. What continues to keep me motivated is we're working on children's issues, right? Ultimately, the work of the Children's Alliance is about serving children and families. And if you can't be motivated by that, then you are in the wrong job. You absolutely are in the wrong job. I am fortunate enough to have, as Gabriella mentioned, a kid who has been blessed in many ways, to have a couple parents that are middle class that can take care of her needs and wants. And I want that for every child. And I think everybody that's on this call wants that for every child. And so if I have the opportunity, and we as the Children's Alliance have the opportunity to advance that work, that's something we should be passionate and motivated every day to do.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think for myself, when I think about just cynicism and holding on to hope, I kind of think about looking around myself. On the one hand, I sort of look to the ancestors, and this is an interesting time to do that because we've lost so many of them recently. I think a lot about John Lewis. I think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I just think about how they really sort of not only tilled the soil, but tilled the soil and planted seeds, and did that with significant challenge and significant opposition. And so I look to the ancestors for inspiration. More and more, I'm looking to, this is going to make me sound like a serious middle-aged lady, but more and more I look to the next generation of leadership.
Yes.
I have learned so much sitting around the Children's Alliance table around what leadership can look like, and particularly how to be reflective about what you're bringing to the table. I think one of the things that was most striking for me, some of my biggest lessons learned from staff at Children's Alliance was really thinking about, how does racism affect me individually? What have I internalized around this in the systems that I'm in? And I think talking to next generation leaders who are younger than I am, and it's not all about age, but I found this to be particularly true. I am feeling myself getting a new lens, getting repositioned, just sort of reframing the work and thinking about myself in the work and thinking about liberation in new and different ways. And so I am grateful to people who talk to me about things I haven't thought of before. Like, what does anti-Blackness look like in the nonprofit sector?
Right.
And what does it mean to have internalized racism that causes me to be so concerned about making mistakes as a Black leader that I become so perfectionist that I become risk averse, right? So those are the things that I'm so grateful for next generation leadership for teaching me those things. And then ultimately, I think you're right. It's like holding kids and families at the center of it and making that just the beacon. That is the beacon of hope there, which is the possibility and opportunity we want to bring to kids. You're right. If you can't hold out hope for kids, this ain't the space. And ultimately, I think work for justice, whatever work you're doing for justice, has to be hope focused. You have to be envisioning something different. But it can be a particular burden it can be a very particular challenge for Black leaders, particularly Black leaders who are operating a lot in spaces that are not Black. To sort of hold some of that at the same time that you are trying to very effectively operate within the culture and within the systems that are there.
You don't know this, but yesterday, in our staff meeting, we had a rich conversation about people of color caucusing and white caucusing, and we had a report back from staff members who were talking about our white caucus and how we serve as allies, and the language that we used. It was the type of conversation that I wish we were having at all institutions, because I think, rather than looking at financial statements and you know, the dog and pony show that usually happens at lots and lots of board meetings. This was a substantive conversation that I think drives the direction of Children's Alliance going forward. And the fact that we advocate with community rather than for community is a profound notion that I didn't really realize until I came into the organization and realized that it's woven into the DNA of the Children's Alliance, that we do not take a position that we know, and therefore we're going to advocate for the communities that we care about. We're going to ask those communities, and we're going to try to empower leaders in those communities to advocate with us, because there's much more power. It has more resonance when we go to the legislature. And so there's so many aspects of the DNA of the Children's Alliance that I just feel honored to be a part of and to help to try to provide leadership for.
Yeah, and those expectations, I think, exist. That exists because our members ask for it, and our members expect it, and our partners in the public policy space expect it, and the board leads on that work. And so I think that that's extraordinary that you're having that experience as well. I'm very happy that is happening.
So can I ask you a question before we
sure
before we start to involve our audience, which
yeah.
you know I'm feeling a little strange about having all these people listening to us talking to each other, so I want to get them involved. I wonder, you know, after more than a decade, closer to 2 decades at the helm of the Children's Alliance, what are you most proud of? What do you feel like you've accomplished that you're most proud of?
You know, I have told people recently that this is the nerdiest answer. I walked into the Children's Alliance, and I walked into so for folks who don't know, who are part of our group discussion today, I started at the Children's Alliance in 1993. I was the public policy coordinator. I shared an office with Lori Lippold, and Lori Lippold very kindly told me I did not need to pick the Bill Digest out of the trash out of the recycling bin in Olympia, that they actually had a room where you could get a fresh copy. So I was very green. But I was a policy nerd and a policy junkie, and I totally loved policy. And I came into the executive director position as a policy person, but along the way became an organizational development and leadership development nerd, big time nerd. And so one of the things that I think I'm the proudest of is really for the organization to have taken the journey to realize that the insides of the organization needed to match the outsides. And that if we were going to talk externally about racial equity and anti-racism in the public policy work that we were pushing, and in our public policy partnerships, we need to do that internally as well. And that meant everything from not just what our board looked like, but how the board operated, not just what the staff diversity was, but really thinking very clearly and hopefully well about power. And just, again, just sort of try to reflect on who we were so that we could bring a genuineness and an integrity around fighting racism to the work for kids. And so I think I am proudest of the work that I was able to do with others. And I am thoroughly grateful for all of the people who helped us with that and who I learned from along the way. But that is my nerdy answer, is that, you know, in addition to things like covering all kids and the work on dental therapy and the incredible work that so many folks have done around trying to build a high quality early learning system and equating, making sure that equity and fighting racism and opportunity and making sure opportunity are available to all kids is part of how we describe quality and early learning. In addition to all of those policy victories, I'm really proud of the work that we did internally to bring authenticity to that work.
I just really had one question, is just, can we broaden our efforts to include all of Washington State? I happen to be from Spokane.
So I'll try to answer part of that. And Paula, I encourage you to have a say if you want to. We have heard that sentiment pretty loudly and clearly from the conversations that I've been a part of before I came on board. I think the strategic plan had a piece in there about expanding the Children's Alliance footprint more broadly. And in some ways, it's, you know, no one would wish the pandemic, but the pandemic does offer us an opportunity to, instead of having lots of in-person meetings all across the state, if we can do a better job of reaching out to folks in different communities and having these types of meetings, we may be able to broaden our outreach. I know that the impact of the Children's Alliance in the state legislature will be much stronger if we have a broad base of support that includes geographic diversity as well as racial diversity. And so that's something that the staff and the board and I will be working really hard to make sure happens going forward.
And I guess I would just add, you know, I spoke a little bit earlier about the member survey that gets sent out and actually gets quite a few responses. That was Sunny, that was strongly that's a message from that member survey as well, that greater connections to folks locally is what folks are looking for, and including around the racial equity work. There were a lot of requests to think about how that work shows up locally, how to be supportive of it locally, and particularly loud and clear from areas that are more rural and areas east of the mountain. So concurred, and it's I'm excited to hear about the Stephan and the team looking further into that.
We had one more question that was submitted beforehand from Josephine about philanthropy. Josephine, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. My question is, as I understand it, philanthropy is trying to pivot from charity to justice. And so how does that look? What does that look like, you know, in the work that the Children's Alliance does?
Ooh, that's a big one. And something that I've been thinking about really, really seriously about how do we move away from white saviorism to deep engagement with the Children's Alliance, and more broadly, the entire sector of philanthropy, I think has as a moment in thinking about this moment and how to respond to it. There's some deep soul searching that various philanthropic organizations have to do to position themselves as partners and not as, you know, benefactors that bestow a small one-year grant on an organization and expect it to do great work. One of the things that I mentioned in my interview for this position was a study that came out from the Chronicle of Philanthropy that compared Black-led organizations to white-led organizations, nonprofit organizations that do similar work. And what the Chronicle of Philanthropy came up with was that Black-led organizations receive about 40% less funding, and the funding comes with significantly more strings attached and usually comes as a one-year grant as opposed to a multi-year grant. And so there are structural issues that the philanthropic sector really has to grapple with. And, you know, I'll be pushing as hard as I can on that issue. One thing that has happened since I've been the executive director is I was asked to participate on a call with a bunch of other executive directors locally, mostly from the Puget Sound area, but also from across Washington state. All of them are people of color. All of them are executive directors of organizations that serve families. And they are all saying, you know, no more of this one-year grant, no more of this, you know, little bit of funding. We are demanding a different structure. And they were sending those letters out to all of the philanthropic organizations that we all know. And hopefully that will start to have some impact. As someone who's worked in philanthropy as well as been a grant recipient, I hope to participate in those efforts, and if I can, to try to push on philanthropy to really be an authentic partner with those of us who are doing this critical work in community.
Mm-hmm. And I guess
I don't know,
what
Paola, if you have something.
yeah, what I would add just from my tenure with the Children's Alliance, not just as executive director, but with the Children's Alliance, is that I know the members of the Children's Alliance, the folks who are in this Brady Bunch tower, what the members hold the Children's Alliance accountable to is the pursuit of justice. And that really it is fundamentally, and it's how the work has been discussed for forever, because it's really about how systems respond and how we are deconstructing systems and reconstructing them to make sure that opportunity is available for all people and all kids, particularly the kids furthest away from opportunity, and that is kids of color, and that is kids living in poverty. That this organization is fundamentally about justice, and the power behind that is the membership. The membership holds us accountable around that work.
Right.
So I think the Children's Alliance is well positioned for that shift, and well positioned to argue for that shift.
Great. Thank you both.
It looks like we have about 4 more questions here, but we also have scheduled to end a little before 1 o'clock. So Gabriela, if you want to ask your kind of closing remarks question, and then we can continue to get to more people's questions if people want to stay a little longer.
Thank you. Thank you. Stephan and Paola, if we were to come back together, this entire group together in 1 year, what do you think the conversation would look like? What do you think we'd be talking about in 1 year?
I'll jump in first. I think we will be celebrating. I think we'll be celebrating Stephan's leadership, celebrating the work that we've done together to come together collaboratively and closely around this work, the ongoing strength of the organization. You know, I think in a year we'll have been through 18 months of the COVID pandemic. We will have been through 18 months of a further stall on opportunity. We're seeing just the inequities that we had deepened by the pandemic, and whether that's the digital divide that keeps kids out of the classroom, being effectively in the classroom right now, whether it's health disparities, et cetera. I hope that what we're coming together to talk about in a year is the incredible work that we've done together to lean into this moment, and to really try to hold ourselves and systems accountable for not perpetuating the gaps that already existed.
And mine is a little bit more short term. Right now, there are multiple efforts afoot to have across the board cuts to respond to the deficit, the state deficit, which is somewhere around $4.4 billion. And many of those cuts will fall disproportionately on families that we care about, on children that we care about. And so my hope is that a year from now, that we will have convinced the state legislature to respond to those cuts in a way that does not hurt the children and families that are already disproportionately impacted by COVID. And instead, that we think about the economic development argument of restarting the economy by investing in childcare and investing in children's health in such a way that those children can then realize their potential, be, eventually be productive members of society. And those are the types of investments that I think that we will be advocating for in this upcoming legislative session. And I believe we can have some impact with a lot of support, because we can't do this alone. And we think that we can have that type of impact if we can rally lots and lots of support.
I am going to continue letting people ask audience questions. But if people have to go, they are welcome to go as well. Christine, did you want to add anything before we continue with audience questions?
Oh, I think, Gabi, I wasn't sure if you wanted to share the information about another event that's coming up in just a couple of weeks.
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, this event is one of the first in a series of online conversations that will explore potential paths forward to advance racial equity for kids. The second event will be on October 13th. Our special guest will be Amy Liu of Microsoft Philanthropies, and she and Stephan will discuss the role of philanthropy in advancing racial equity. We will drop the registration in the chat. We'll also send you an email right after this event.
Thanks, Gabi.
You're welcome.
For anyone who wants to stay for more audience questions, the next one would be from Jenny English. Did you want to ask your question?
Okay, you could ask it, but my question is about the impact of John Gould's departure. And I noticed that he has left the meeting. We all, of course, are very thankful for John Gould, but how is the Children's Alliance going to, or how are you dealing with his loss, and who is going to continue that role?
That's a great question, and thank you for highlighting the incredible role that John has played. Everything that I've heard since taking this responsibility is that John and Paola were a pretty dynamic duo, and that dynamic duo is going to be difficult to replace going forward. And so I take that really, really seriously, because I know that they had tremendous influence in the state legislature, and John had done, you know, incredible work and is revered in the state legislature. What I've been told since being in this role is that there's a unique opportunity for me to kind of step into sector leadership, which involves both having a strong presence in the state legislature and also working with practitioners, particularly in early learning and healthcare. And so I'm happy to step into that role. We're going to have to figure out some way to make sure that the wheels stay on the bus as we're doing those pieces of work. And I'm very much committed to making sure, along with the staff, that we have the capacity to both deliver on the opportunities that is there, and also to be thinking about long-term organizationally what is the best approach for us to take. It's not going to be easy. No one replaces John Gould and Paola, as you well know, but I think we have a pretty good organizational structure by which we can distribute the work and really rely on our communities to give us guidance and direction as to the direction that we take.
Great, thank you. I have enjoyed meeting you, Stephan, this way. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Come on, hit us with these questions. Come on.
Next up would be really Richard and Gretchen Wilkinson. If you're still here, did you want to ask your question?
Oh, hi. Hi, Stephan.
Hi.
So,
Richard.
hey, I think it's our group talked about the necessity to get concrete, and like when you're starting to talk about childcare, that sort of thing. Those are very concrete ways to advance the justice agenda. But I think always is a good question: how will you know you're making progress? One of the risks of nonprofits is the challenges are always long term. You don't have a a quarter to quarter kind of profit that you can measure. So the question, it's maybe it's just one more for you and the board to talk about the staff, but it's how do you know, particularly with the changes going on, how do you know you're making progress?
Thank you. Thanks for that question, Richard. That's a great question. And we are definitely not a nonprofit organization that looks quarter to quarter at our impact. I'm going to pitch it to Paola and see how in the past you have known that you're doing the right work.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and a challenging one, particularly I think for advocacy organizations. It is harder to kind of see, it can feel harder to see what you're doing from a quarter to quarter basis. But I think part of obviously what you're trying to do is track, I think, three things. One is we always want to be data driven. We question the data and make sure that the data is sufficient and is counting everybody it needs to count. But the data will tell us at the end of the day, and data being both the quantitative data and the qualitative data that comes out of community, whether we're making the changes that we want to make. So that's always one piece. A second piece that we're tracking is really how far ahead are we moving policies? And so, if it's just a binary measurement, does the policy pass or does the policy not pass? That's not the best measure. A better measure is what kind of traction are you getting? What kind of audience are you getting? Are you getting more, legislative champions? Are you gathering more partners? And then I think the third thing is, that's the results, population level results for kids. That's certainly a question of looking at policy victories, because that's the field in which we work, is public policy change. And it's also movement building. So one thing I think we look at, keep saying we, and I'm going to own that we, because members are the fuel of the Children's Alliance. And so I'm going to continue to be the fuel of the Children's Alliance. But it's also looking at who is advocating alongside you. What is the state of your relationships with communities? I appreciated Sunny calling out earlier that a stronger relationship, east of the mountains is an important thing. To look beyond the, our natural strengths in the I-5 corridor. But those are the kinds of those movement metrics. Do people, and then there are things that are harder to measure, but I think you can come up with proxies for them, which is, do people trust you? Do people feel you have integrity? Do people feel as though you are leaning into your leadership or leaning into the leadership around racial equity and not stepping back? How genuine are the relationships with people who are directly impacted, and to what degree, when we have a chance as an organization to speak, is it our voice, and what degree is it the voice of people who are directly impacted? So I think there are these pieces that can be measured along the way that talk about the strength and integrity of the movement that can be important markers along the way to making progress. World's longest answer. Sorry.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more audience question, and that would be from Bruce Lamb. You actually had two questions if you want to ask one or both of those to close us out.
Well, why don't I ask both and they can pick which one they'd like to answer, Paola and Stephan. Yeah, sorry, I was just getting ready to run to another deal, but with so many laws and policies that have a disparate racial impact on youth, how does your organization decide which ones to take on? How do you prioritize? And then secondly, how can someone who's just getting to know the organization stay informed and support the work, the advocacy work?
Go, Stephan.
So I only heard part of the question. My internet is unstable all of a sudden. I know that Bruce was talking, my dear friend Bruce Lamb was talking, but I didn't hear the questions.
Oh, yes, I can reread them if you want, or Bruce, you can go ahead.
That's fine, you can read them.
Bruce wrote, with so many laws and policies that have racially disparate impact on youth, how does Children's Alliance decide which ones to take on? And he also wrote, how can those who are just getting to know the organization stay informed of the priority issues and support the organization's work?
Mm. Thank you for both questions. I'll start off with the first one and say that there are lots of priorities. What we've heard from community so far is there are lots of different issues that are top priorities for them. Right now, response to COVID is #1 on that list. And there's a survey that came out recently that said that 46% of childcare organizations in Washington state will be out of business within the next month or two. And as someone who's been in the education space, I know that if you don't have good childcare, one, you can't restart the economy, but two, it has a devastating impact on the life chances of children as they grow up to be students and as they grow up to be adults. And so we see that as a top priority. There are members of our communities that are talking to us about how healthcare has been detrimentally impacted by COVID. And so those are our two primaries, but I also recognize that in other states across the nation, there are advocacy organizations that have a large portfolio of issues that they advocate for. And it's my hope and the board's hope that over time we will be able to increase our ability to advocate on multiple issues, because we realize that particularly anyone that understands how kids fall through the cracks, they fall through the cracks when there are multiple issues that their families are not able to deal with. So we want to be able to be an advocacy organization that responds to children's needs from the moment that they're born to the day that they leave for college, and maybe beyond that. And that's what my hope is. And with lots of help, we may be able to get there in the short term, because there is definite need for that type of advocacy.
Thank you.
Well, I think that that's the end of our event today. I want to take a minute to thank all of you for joining us today, engaging with us, for sharing your thoughts and great questions about the work ahead. Please continue to engage and hold us accountable to the things we discussed today. If you had a question but it did not get answered today, please make sure you respond to the post-event survey in the mail, in the email, and add it to your feedback. And once again, thank you for spending time with us today. Hopefully you can join us for the next events, which I know the coordinators will be sending that out. And have a good afternoon.